Yes, hello, good morning and welcome everybody to this first of the 5 design dialogues in Enter Milan. My name is Francine van Westrenen. I'm the head of the agency department of Het Nieuwe Instituut for Architecture, Design and Digital Culture. And I'm very happy to welcome you here. I think the reason we are in this very particular and peculiar surroundings of Enter it started with an invitation by Jozef Grima, the director of the Design Academy Eindhoven, to take part in this presentation in Milan. Also to celebrate maybe this first reappearance of the design world in Milan after the COVID pandemic. And well, we're still, I think, in hopefully the last phase of that, but let's see. At least you are there. I'm in Rotterdam. And I think this will be our live for probably for some time still, that we are here and some are there, and we are talking in this kind of, hybrid space. And I think that is also what we created with Enter. So the invitation of the Design Academy to join forces in Milan resulted in a physical presentation of the students of bachelor students of the Design Academy, and the digital platform offered and facilitated by Het Nieuwe Instituut called Enter. And we made a program starting every day for 5 days with design dialogues, moderated by Angela Rui, design critic and curator. We had the pleasure of working together in the Triennale 2 years ago. We just remembered that the I See That I See What You Don't See exhibition in 2019, which was a real pleasure. And before I give you the word, I'd like to thank a few people because, this presentation was made in a very short period of time. And I thank Martina Muzzi and Nikita Hurkmans, and of course, Jozef Grima, actually for helping us out and actually for all the good conversations that we had. And of course, Florian van Zandwijk, the developer of and designer of Enter, together with some others. Joyce Hansen, the project leader, Elisa Penagini, the producer in Milan, Söner Aslan and Bruno Vogel, who make it all technically possible, because that's also a hell of a job, I would say. So thank you all, and I give the floor to Angela and Jozef and Eric, and enjoy the dialogues.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to to have this morning dialogues, design dialogues with a beautiful group of people and friends and critics and architects and designers and so on and so on. And so let's start immediately, because the time we have is very brief. So the topic of today is about design as collaboration. And so the session highlights collaborative practices within design, extending beyond the notion of individual authorship. It puts collective thinking at the center of design education and practice. So just to make a brief introduction, it's maybe a difficult concept to elaborate today, in this particular moment when our lives have never been so digital, and that to some degree so isolated. Nevertheless, the good aspect has been that we finally noticed what we were missing, right? Like physical contacts, or agency for being disconnected, agency for privacy, direct contact with someone we love, as well as the need to fight for unrecognized collective rights, which is probably surely the most important thing we are discussing during these days. We also have recognized our own vulnerability as a society, right? And as living beings. So it's like we are facing an ontological crisis, an ontological moment, which is mining certainties in a way, at an intimate individual level, but at the institutional level too. So nevertheless, what we know, or we think we know, is that design has been always social, but probably it is just a matter of recognizing for what society we are willing for today. So we all embody the idea that the world around us is made by a pluriverse of, you know, ecologies, agents, actors, they co-create each other and influence each other. So let's start. I will just, you know, give you a very large question, very wide one, and then I present you, so you have the time also to collect some thoughts in the meanwhile. So we often hear for, you know, this statement, which is Super Bowl, which is design should be for the real world. But then, okay, what is real and what is the word and what design should be, maybe. So let's think about that. In the meanwhile, I introduce very briefly the day. So the panel includes a light session. So we would start with Arik Chen and Josef Grima, and then we will continue with Hus Baumer, Brandon Cormier, and Moran, presenting the beautiful publication they worked in the last year, maybe, or more, which is collecting the 8 years of the activity of this amazing institution. So, Arik is, we all know, but is a general art director at the New Institute. So congratulations, Arik.
Thank you.
Okay, but also he's a curator, professor, writer, and creative director who have served in multiple leadership roles, working across the architecture and design fields and the intersection with other disciplines. I could mention a lot of the recent projects, but I also think that most of us know what the activity of you two has been in the recent time. Josef Grima, he's an art director of the Design Academy Eindhoven, so thank you also for this invitation that is coming from you too, and the founder of the research studio Space Caviar, which is based in Milan. He defined himself as an architect, curator, researcher, and editor. And also for you, I will stop here and give you, you know, the stage to reflect on that question of design for the real world. Who want to start?
Go for it.
Eric, come on. Okay, let's start with Eric.
All right. Well, we're also eager to answer your question, Angela. So thank you for that. I think maybe there are ways of discussing this on two levels, right? When you talk about design in the real world, we can talk about the relationship between research and, let's say, practice, right? And at least for me, you know, there, as we all know, has been a real shift towards speculation in recent years, which is a really sort of important way of creating scenarios that we can anticipate, and also in doing so, sort of respond to what's going on in the world. But at the same time, you know, you were talking earlier about global crises, and in many ways we don't have time to just speculate anymore. And so the key will be to sort of explore the threshold between speculation and enactment, let's say, or positing and reality, in order to present sort of to really test out different possibilities and multiple approaches in confronting some of the big questions that we're confronting. And this is something that I'm hoping that New Institute can sort of focus on a little bit in the coming years. Now, on another level, I think we're talking about design's engagement with the outside world, let's say, when we talk about design and reality. And I think it's important for us in this wonderful design world to kind of always be aware that we need to be talking to people outside of our world as well, and to avoid this sort of very natural impulse towards insularity. And as you and Francine were both kind of evoking earlier, you know, in this sort of pandemic period while we're all on a screen right now and so on and so forth, you know, in some ways I have found these new modes of communication and restriction to be really helpful reinforcing at least my understanding of my role as a curator previously with the public, because I was just in Lisbon, as you know, Angela, where we both had exhibitions at MAT that are closing now, and I was fortunate to finally be able to see it. But until then,
today,
it was,
actually.
until then, it was going to be the third exhibition I curated that I had not been able to physically see myself. And for me, of course, that's a little bit sad, but it was also a reminder that we don't curate for ourselves. Actually, we curate for the people who come see our exhibitions. And even right now, we all lament how we can't be in the same place, which is why we're always on these screens doing these talks. But in fact, you know, Joseph and I and you are all in the same room. In fact, I think if I do this, you'll see my hand. And that reinforces to me the fact that we're not talking for, right back at you. We're not talking for ourselves, but we're actually talking for the people who are watching. So this sort of dissonance has been, in fact, I think, a real reinforcement of how we need to engage.
How do you feel? I mean, in this connection, disconnection, you know, it's like, it's very kind of weird, right? To pertain to the two domains at the same time, or what is missing?
I mean, I think that the conditions that we just came through are obviously have really tested the limits in many, many ways. Certainly speaking on behalf of the Design Academy, it's been an incredibly traumatic time. And I think also in your role, Angela's one of the kind of main points of reference of the master's department. You've experienced yourself and you've seen how the students have suffered so much. But one message that I always really try to remind us all at the Design Academy is that we need to learn from this moment also how we can build what we can learn from this moment of incredible collective mobilization. I think that what has been achieved, I mean, the much more could be achieved. There's all sorts of crises around vaccinations right now, and about you know, how do we find some sort of collective action to overcome this moment? But in general, I think it's one of the few times that the world, more or less, sometimes more, sometimes less, but in general has collectively mobilized. And this is what we need now, is collective mobilization. So if we can see the pandemic as a sort of a dry run or a test for a much more ambitious mobilization, which obviously, needless to say, is in reference to the climate crisis, then I think this can be a very valuable moment. It's something that can bring us, for all the suffering that it costs, it can bring us great value. But beyond that, I think that even the climate crisis maybe isn't the biggest crisis. I think there are crises of a different order and of a different magnitude that are really related more to inequality and to the way that the kind of distribution of resources on a planetary scale is structured at present. And I think the climate crisis is part of that. It's connected to that, and it'll become an accelerator of that. But that is, in fact, we need to keep we have a goal in front of us, which is to overcome the pandemic. We need to keep our eyes on a goal that is on the horizon, which is somehow overcoming this massive crisis we have. But what should be really in the forefront of our minds is how not only we just don't fry ourselves on this planet, but actually how we're going to make this planet into the sort of place that we want to spend more time on. And that brings me back actually just to your first, a quick comment on your first question about design and for the real world. Of course, that was actually the book Design for the Real World by Victor Papanek was one of the reasons I became an architect, because I grew up in a family of architects and artists. My mother's an artist, my father's an architect, and that book, Design for the Real World, way before I had anything to do with architecture, was kind of sitting on the living room table. And it really introduced to me the idea of, kind of also coming back to the more general topic of the talk, the idea that design doesn't necessarily need to be about heroics. It can be about small gestures that improve life.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, incredibly important for me.
What are the small gestures you could do from, for example, you know, education? Well, there are mechanics that are not so flexible, right? So how can we really take this occasion to try to change the mechanics or the infrastructure of, for example, how do we shape curricula?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's an incredibly difficult question, as somebody who teaches yourself knows. I think this is one of the big problems that we face, not as school, but as a society, is that over the last 50 years, the academic institutions that form the future designers, the future doctors, the future politicians, future sociologists, all of the different functions of our society have become increasingly structured in a way that is about kind of narrowing the boundaries, the remit of the discipline. They've also become much more regulated. It's an academic environment today, there's very little room for doing anything different from what was done 10 years ago, or that will be. It's really the rules and laws about everything. And paradoxically, that is one of the biggest dangers that we run as a species, I think, is that we've kind of run ourselves into this rut of hyper-specialization, which we've enforced by law and through government, for practices of governance. And now, unless we very quickly get ourselves out of this, we're just not going to be able to adapt quickly enough. So what can we do in practical terms? I think the first thing that it's a very relevant question in the context of design and collaboration. The first thing that we need to teach to our students and to provide a platform for is the idea that design is not about individual, certainly not about heroism, but even not about achieving goals individually. It's about how we can work together. And thinking, and design is obviously part of also that, helping other people to work together more effectively.
Thank you. Yeah, connecting to what we are discussing right now, maybe this is a question for Arik, about, again, the mechanics of the institution as a for example, a place like the New Institute, which is, we were discussing, but it is already now a very special body. But what is like after this moment, after noticing and knowing that we have to provoke some changes to go to serve the need of the planet too, what do we do to imagine alternative forms of collectiveness? Do we challenge, for example, the status quo, or we do that searching for meaningful forms of kinship, alliances, and in that case, in the second case, what kind of alliances, what kind of collectivity do you both also imagine for the institutions we are discussing now?
Yeah, well, I think to your point, and to what and to Joseph's last point, I feel very fortunate to be inheriting, so to speak, an institution that, in its 8 years of existence, has adapted and morphed and mutated multiple times in many ways. And I have to give a lot of credit to my predecessor, Hoos Boymer, who you'll all be hearing from in a second, for kind of embedding this constant. This sort of constant newness, let's say, in the New Institute, and in that sense, I think, hopefully, we're really well positioned to explore these kind of different ways of working and thinking, and I hope more and more doing that. We're going to need as a species, as Joseph says. Now, that's not the case with every institution. And I think in the case of Eindhoven, Joseph says that this is highly regulated, but I think in the case of many other institutions, a lot of it's just sort of historical baggage and inertia. And so what we can do in those cases is really sort of, I guess, I don't know, I don't want to say lead by example, but at least show by example that there are other ways of approaching things and working that maybe aren't so scary, that aren't threatening to the sort of fundamentals of institutions that people in institutions often work so hard to so fiercely protect. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. You both work as curators, researchers, and curators, and we know very well how much difficult it is to translate then topics you want to explore into spaces and exhibitions for an audience that is still used to go to a place and visit an exhibition. How do we elaborate on that? How can we verbalize this change also to audience or the new audience in a different way, understanding also the limit or the forces of the exhibition as a model for knowledge construction and distribution.
That's a super interesting topic that I think at an institutional level, a lot of institutions are really thinking about this, about how exhibitions cannot be simply, you know, a static representation of knowledge that already exists or ideas that already exist, but can in themselves become a form of production of knowledge. Just to kind of, I guess the thing that's closest to this that we're working on at the moment, outside of the Design Academy world, but in my studio, is Project Non-Extractive Architecture at the VAC in Venice, in which VAC Foundation very generously put at our disposal a platform of an exhibition space, a wonderful Fondazione VAC Zattere, to invite residents to come and research and really make transparent to the public the process of thinking about the critical issues that face design. And I think that publics are increasingly also demanding to be part of the process in institutions, rather than simply experiencing passively the what is put in front of them, but to really become part of it. And I think there's a lot of, I think the New Institute has really pioneered this over the years, and has been a wonderful platform for also especially within the design community, but in many occasions also outward looking towards a much broader audience, forms of exhibiting that are not simply about putting objects on plinths. And I think that with Eric's leadership, this is only going to become much stronger.
All right. Yeah, I think that there is also a matter of time, no? The long-term projects probably permit you, if you give you the time to work on certain topics, then, you know, also the exhibition model can follow that, and without being like, you know, a dogma, without becoming a dogma, but maybe following step by step the long-term researches that are, you know, with which we are all engaged. I have a final question, but it's just like, not a question, but just, you know, something I always think about, which is about care. So we all talk about care, how much this notion is important, not to bring care within the profession, within the work, within, you know, the care for the other and the more than human ones and so on. But I think we also have to be very careful to distinguish the genuine care and the performance of care that sometimes the institution use, again, as you know, as a tool to align with a certain topics. What do you think about that? Genuine care, or it's more a performative way of discussing more generally on topics we are researching and so on? What the notion of care should be? You know, like, how can we embrace this notion in a genuine way and not just as a performance we do as curators, thinkers, and, you know, and also directors of very, very crucial institutions for knowledge production, of course. I know the face, no one wants to reply or say something.
All right. Yeah, I mean, so, you know, I think this notion of care is definitely one that well, I mean, who's gonna argue with that? But
yeah.
But for me, you know, I still tend to sort of fall back on maybe the old-fashioned notion of empathy, right? Because for me, the idea of care still kind of implies a sort of hierarchy. Maybe, you know, you care for something, whereas empathy acknowledges that you can never sort of leave your own subjectivity, right? Like no matter what, you're sort of stuck with with who you are, for better or worse, and your own perspective. But empathy really forces you to try to see things from other vantage points. And so for me, it's not only about caring, but it's also about expanding your thinking at the same time.
Joseph.
I really think that I really like the idea of thinking of care. I mean, on one level, I agree with Eric. I think that it is, and I think it's also the point you were trying to make, Angela, that one can romanticize the idea of care, and it can become quite superficial very quickly. But in general, I think it's a very useful word for our profession, in the sense that I like to think of architects especially, but also designers, as individuals who feel some sort of responsibility for the environment and help people to take care of the environment and to take care of each other. And to think of the city as a form of a kind of a reciprocal safety net, and the best possible sort of the materialization of the best possible conditions for everybody who is present. And when you start to think about it that way, certain things come in, for example, that you start to think very long term. There's it's kind of a well-known, one of the kind of well-known characteristics of, for example, indigenous American peoples is the idea that any decision that is made collectively is questioned from the point of view of 7 generations ahead. So thinking about what I decide to do today, how is that going to look to my great granddaughter? And is she going to be happy? Is she going to basically, mandarme a culpa, is it? Or to use, I'm trying to think of the English version. Or will I actually have somehow planted a seed that will provide some form of compound interest, and that will really bring benefit, incredible benefit, through a small gesture of mine to 7 generations in the future. If we could start to think in that way about our cities, our countryside, every single building that we design, then I think it would just, so many of the solved problems that we spend so much time, effort, energy, money solving would automatically disappear themselves. So placing care at the center of the idea of what we are as designers, I think, is a fundamental gesture that is going to be necessary for us to, and I think it comes back also very much to this idea of designing for the real world. Designing for the real world is about taking care.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this is a beautiful way of closing our conversation. Thank you so much. Good luck for your, present, not future, just present. And thank you to be here and share with us your thinking, basically. And I would like to welcome immediately, like, next speakers we have. So I invite Guus Burmer and Guus Burmer, Brendan Cormier, and Moren is already here. I can do that. The others, we are here together. And so let's continue this conversation together. Give me just 1 second to present you. So Guus Burmer, founding director of the New Institute, who recently bade farewell as the director of the Institute, right? But today we are here to discuss one of the latest ventures, which is this amazing book, which is titled Expansive Bodies, Contesting Design at the New Institute. We will do it with the brilliant Brendan Cormier, who is here with us. Brendan is the senior curator of exhibition and special project at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and he's also the editor of the book. We knew that you still have to receive it, so just to
it looks beautiful.
Arrived from the press. And we are here also with Moren, graphic designer, educator at the Academy of Visual Arts in Leipzig, who has always worked very closely with Guus as the art director of the New Institute. So maybe we can just continue what we started to discuss with Joseph. And and Arik about this idea of expansion, I would say, expansive notion of of what, for example, an institution could be. And I think, Horst, you're a perfect person, of course, who can tell us about, the notion of not only of, expansion in terms of which are the disciplines that are, present at the institute and express themselves there, but also I would suggest you start from the very beginning of the new institute, just to frame a little bit the context, because I think it's very related also with the book, with the object that the book presents. So, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. I think you're completely right, is that we really wanted to, you could say, give a kind of a panoramic image of the last 8 years, which of course starts with this moment of disruption that a cultural system, at least in the Netherlands, suddenly is faced with draconic cutbacks. Because interestingly, Brendan and I researched this question a little bit. You see that the cultural infrastructure in the Netherlands started during the Nazis, and in fact was embraced and continued by the Dutch government since 45. Structure was constantly grown and got more money, got more legitimacy, you could say, for its ambitions, until this particular year, somewhere in the beginning of 2013, that you could say, let's call it neoliberal forces. It always sounds very adventurous. Neoliberal forces said, okay, culture seems to lack in legitimacy, and let's come up with a cutback, which was then realized by merging 3 institutes into one, and this was called the New Institute. And I was, I think, one of the first people approached with a question, are you interested in setting up a new institute? And I thought it was a beautiful question, to set up an institute in the 21st century. And of course, this started with the question, and I think the notion of expansion, which Brendan immediately derived from this particular question, embedded in this notion, like, it had to be multidisciplinary, it had to expand the disciplinary expansions or definitions. But it's of course odd, and this is something I think a kind of dilemma which the book also shows, is namely that, education, like already referred to, they're all very much embedded in very strict definitions about what it is, what it has to represent, what it stands for. And at the same time, you create a new institute which needs to go beyond these very different borders. So I think the institute in itself represents a paradox. And to be honest, and that's something which Eric will be confronted with, is of course hopelessly dysfunctional. But that's the beauty of the institute, at least in my perspective.
You often use the term idiosyncratic.
Yes.
Could you just elaborate on that?
Well, you see that in those moments of disruptions, nobody knows. So you see politicians looking for the possibility to come up with a new legitimacy for culture. And they find it in of course, the dominant reality of the now, which is an economy. So they come up creative industries and so on, in order to create legitimacy for a vast system of academies, universities, opera houses, and so on, creative industries. At the same time, they prefer to build up a new type of rhetoric around multidisciplinarity, that already, and then it's also presented as a national institute, not a national museum, a national institute, which is a fundamental conversation for the last 20 years already. Also of the NIE, it was called a Dutch Architectural Institute, not a museum. In other words, the importance is focused on knowledge production. You know, they want to have a knowledge producing institute within the field of the creative industries in order to legitimize a cultural infrastructure. Well, you see all the complexities there.
Exactly. It's about complexity, and it's about also contestation, right? I think another thing that emerges not only from the title, but also from, you know, your whole work in 8 years there, is this idea of questioning or investigating around design contestation. Why?
Well, for some odd reason, I think everybody, when we started to have, we started with a so-called convent period. You know, we were all, I think the whole field was a little bit in shock. You know, you become used to the fact that, you know, each year you can expand, each year there's more money, and suddenly all this legitimacy is taken away. And this, of course, eats on you. Why? What happened? What did we do wrong? You know, our classic notions of autonomy or whatever are no longer important. What is it? So we thought, okay, we need a period that we just give ourselves the time to self-reflect. And I think, Maureen, we remember this period, which we call the convent period, in order to close down for a few months. I think in total it was 3 months. And to say, okay, we are given the possibility to come up with a so-called new institute. You know, what is it? And to us, you know, this question of what is it was at the beginning very important. And then I think we quite quickly shifted to another question, namely, what could it be? You know, what could it be was a very interesting, and the notions, for instance, of identity were less important to us than the idea of potential. And through this idea of potential being more important than an identity, the notion of being expensive in the grain of your institutional being was already introduced.
I think that what it could be has never been fixed into something, into a formula, into, you know, the perfect machine of the institution. And I think that one of the most also beautiful thing of all these years of the Institute is exactly that. It's constantly trying to, you know, question also the role of the institution itself, and the ways that the institution should find find new methods for knowledge transmission, not only production, you know. But Brendan, I imagine that the effort of taking all this, you know, material, which is exactly about unstable, you know, threads and complexity, and which is exactly what we like of the New Institute. The beautiful way in which complexity is taken and you know and worked and questioned again. But then you had to work on the book, and so how did you find a method to, you know, to narrate this story?
I'm so sorry, Brendan.
I read your text, and but this is coming from, again, from the title. You're talking about bodies, you know, different bodies, who they are or what they are.
Yeah. It was incredibly daunting experience to try and understanding an institution that, you know, I feel like I was also following quite closely over the last 8 years. But when you jump into actually what it was, then you realize, you know, just the sheer amount and volume of production is overwhelming. And so there was a long digestive period. But I think it's exactly what you say, Angela, about this idea of instability, of a certain instability of narrative thread that I found really interesting, and is probably why instead of trying to have an authorial voice, the strategy for the book was really to bring together oral histories of different practitioners and people involved in the Institute. So there was we engaged in about 15 interviews with various people in the Institute, and then tried to kind of weave it into a Rashomon kind of tale. I wish there had been more contradictions and people saying opposite things to each other. Unfortunately, there was a certain degree of agreement amongst people, and it is hard to get people out of their, let's say, institutional safe voice. But that was the plan, was to gather 15 different tellings of the Institute from 15 different perspectives.
Yeah, amazing. Also the collection of all the interviews with, you know, people that we know because we collaborated, people we didn't know but we wish we could. And it's so beautiful to read and to see this thread of voices that are crossing, you know, the complexity of images and also the projects, long-term projects that then manifest in different exhibitions and so on. And so maybe this is also the nice moment to have also the case of Moran here, because Moran worked on the graphic design of the publication, right? And Moran, in which way the notion of collaboration here became the part of this project?
Yeah, when I looked at the title, of course, I immediately thought there is a lot of collaboration in here, in this book. And on the other hand, there's also not. So, because when Guus actually was saying the pretension is more important than the identity, I immediately thought it also reflects very much on the book, how we did it. In terms of that we ask, actually, because at the New Institute, I'm a graphic designer, I have the position of an art director. So we work a lot with different kind of designers for many projects. So we really embrace the designer and we try to commission as much as designers as possible, etc. So also in the case of this book, I really thought like, okay, who is going to do this book? So it was also the question, do I have to do it myself? I didn't do so much at the New Institute, but once in a while I do. Because of course I also have a long-term relationship with Guus. But then actually I proposed to do something which actually fits very much to the New Institute as what we did in the last couple of years, to ask more people. So what we did for each chapter, we asked another designer, because Brandon divided the book in these chapters with every time a different topic, and asking for each chapter, indeed, another designer also give, you know, an answer on all the pretension. So also on the different voices, on the different way of making books and languages. So in that sense, it's really one big collaboration. But on the other hand, it was also interesting that the designers we asked, they didn't know from each other what they were doing. So everybody they were in touch with us, Brandon, me, and other people from the New Institute, but we didn't share what they were doing. So I thought that was also kind of interesting. So at the end, many of the designers, when they received the book, it was also for them the first time that they saw the result. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, totally. Okay, Brendan, so could you just tell us how was to create this hardware? Because we know that all of us are willing for collaboration or to extend also the notion of collectivity and agency within the same project, for example. But how was it for you? How came this idea of, understanding how to narrate this story through different chapters, of course, but also, having a very strong part coming from and through the voices of people and storytelling and so on and so on. Because I see that what you wanted to do, it was not to find like a temporal way of narrating these 8 years, but more to go through, again, the threads and trying to find also connections between different projects and so on. So,
yeah. Well, I think I started out with the idea of doing a book that interested me is the ephemeral nature of institutions and this incredible amount of program and cultural output that often disappears. And the New Institute, for various reasons, and it's not a criticism against it, hasn't put out a huge body of, a catalog for every exhibition it's made. It's made a few catalogs, but there, in terms of kind of a cohesive overview of everything it's done, at the very beginning, the idea was really basic, which was simply to kind of list it all out and put it in some pages and give it some sense of permanence. But it's a very funny project because as it went along, you know, you start with one idea and you learn more and more about the Institute. If I were to start it again, I probably wouldn't do the book the way it was done. So it can be read as a series of kind of decisions made and semi-aborted along the way. But I think maybe to kind of give one kind of sense that I think I'm quite happy with the result of the book is it's about this notion of authorship. And actually in the contesting, there's a lot to be unpacked with that word contesting. It was a bit of an accidental option of a title that I put to Guus, and then Guus thought it was naughty, I think was your words. You liked it because it sounded naughty. But there's a lot to be thought about what is it actually, what is the Het Nieuwe Instituut contesting? Well, it's contesting quite a few things. It's contesting kind of the dictates of professional bodies to define what design is.
Yeah.
But another thing that it was really contesting throughout was the notion of a singular author. I mean, this comes up over and over and over again. And who is the author? And so in one sense, it was to kind of reject authorship altogether. But then, of course, you can't reject authorship altogether because we are all authors. And so I found it really interesting how, and sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but an unresolved but really interesting problem is how to give credit to who did what and who's doing what to what things. And so actually with the design of these chapters, we were very fortunate in that one author, the photographer, who's done all the photography for the New Institute for the last 8 years, Johannes, he gave over his authorship of photography and allowed graphic designers to do whatever they like. And so I think it's that generosity of spirit that's really interesting as a model.
Amazing, yeah. That's true. So it's like, how do we start? How do you start from the body of work of a photographer who spent 8 years, you know, representing the activity of an institute? But I go back 1 second because I would like to ask Guus about, you know, this changing time and all the effort of maintaining a certain complexity and stability of the institute itself. There is the text with which the book ends, where you are mentioning about the 3 P, if I'm not wrong, which is the switch, you know, inside the discipline itself, inside design and visual cultures, the idea that, or your statement about these phases that the discipline itself, in a way, lived and surpassed. And you mentioned like from product to prototype to probe. And maybe it would be nice also to understand from your words, what do you mean with this passage of the discipline? So from what we know, because we come from that field of product design or production systems in general, to what is happening today, which is completely different, right? And very much related with the genuine notion of research and reformulation of the tools that the discipline is using right now.
Well, thank you very much, Angela, for the question. As always, you know, I have to become extremely boring because I have to look at the way you could say the designer is designed, which is one of the fundamental questions of the Institute. And in my own little research, I came to the conclusion that there are 2 very interesting contradictory elements if you look at policy. One is that you could say there is an idea that design should be emancipated, should become for the real world. And they
what is real?
They give that emancipation on one hand to the institutes. And in the beginning, there are 3 huge or 4 huge institutes in order to do so. At the same time, they come up with a toolbox of a financing subsidy system, which is very much based on a 19th century notion of the artist as an individual, you know, organized around notion of style and notion of qualities which could be discussed together, and we can have a kind of, you know, a joint idea about it. So you see at the same time something very interesting happening is a kind of fight between institutes and individual designers about what this emancipation of design entails. And this led to the fact that a lot of, you could say, new institutes have been killed through the year and shot because different ideas about emancipation came up. So what you see, and that is what I want to address, is how an outside configuration of elements and demands has created certain notions of design. And of course, there's the old modernist notion that the designer is the ultimate partner of an industrialized society, and that creates products, you know, and very much, of course, dealing with notions of volume. Upscaling was one of the central words. And then you see, especially in the Netherlands, and I think it invented the notion of Dutch design. You know, you see certain tools becoming available for art, for designers, but which were once employed by artists, namely self-promotion, presentation, internationalization. And you see that at that time the industry is gone, and designers produce prototypes which, you know, interestingly enough, are not made for a possible industry, but are made for communication. To be honest, that's one of the reasons why the Institute was dealing with the question of communication so much, because, you know, during the 80s and 90s, design in the Netherlands was completely focused towards communication. So in fact, the New Institute had to problematize this a little bit, you know, design as communication. And what you see in you could say the last 10 years, and of course you see again a transition coming up with the idea of a much more embedded notions of knowledge, is the fact that design wants to produce almost its own authority by speculating, as Eric and Joseph already referred to, and using the tools of both artistic and academic research in order to do so. So you see again a much more, another transition which I call the probe, and it's not a word I invented, it's a word which came out of a conversation that I had with master students from the Design Academy, and they wanted to set up something which they called the collective. So it's very interesting that these notions come up, and they said, look, what we are doing, we call on one hand border objects, you know, objects which reveal a possible reality more than the real, because that's maybe one of our fundamental issues here. And interestingly enough, Saskia van Stijn just opened an exhibition at the Institute referring to the body of work of Walt Disney. And what she reveals, of course, is that design created not so much a real world, but created a fictional world. And this fictional world was made real, and just like the real world was made fictional. So that's a very interesting, I think, moment where we arrive in as an organization. What did I want to say? Well, I want to say that this particular group of people said, look, Gustav, we are not interested in design as products. You know, we are questioning this industrial environment. We are also not interested in design as purely as communication, you know, as forms of representation. What we are interested in is in the possibility to use objects as possible tools for research in order to intervene into possible realities. I have no idea what it means, but I found it extremely intriguing. So that's why I thought it was important that the Institute would, you know, just show a little bit how design transformed from product to prototyping to probing, and that with these transformations, the need for different forms of representation, different institutes, of course, is also coming along. And maybe certain platforms which we have nowadays are still completely focused on communication and representation. Sorry for being too elaborate as always.
No, now we try to close all together. So this is a question, especially from Brendan and for Maureen. Do you think that a book, as you know, is an object, right? does it try to stabilize, to, you know, to write down on stones something that has been done, or how do you eventually think about a book today? What is it? Is it an exhibition, or it becomes like a thinking tool, or it's a way of just revealing, you know, the mechanism of an institution which is made by people and includes people and try to include people as much as possible, and different activities and an audience with all the, of course, difficulties that a changing and shifting time as the one we are living today, not only after the pandemic, but also before. The world was already changed, right? So we are really into like a very changing time. So I'm just questioning what is the role of a book today, especially in this very moment where we can really, you know, maintain for a minute something which basically we think it's true, for example, or it should be. Should remain as a valid probe of an activity, etc. So sorry for I have been long, but yeah.
Do you want to go first, Marin, or I can jump in?
Whatever.
I mean, you have a lot more history with the book as an artifact than I do, but I mean, maybe I would just say, you know, there was on the surface, there was a very kind of obvious opportunity or interpretation of a book like this to be a way of post-rationalizing activity of the last 8 years and trying to use the power of the Institute's budget to put out its official narrative, you know, setting the record straight about what Het Nieuwe Instituut was. Fortunately, fortunately, it didn't happen that way. You know, there could have been a structure of the book that was a grand narrative, and that's totally against Guus's style. And so, you know, it's much more of a postmodern kind of collage. But I would actually then, you know, books seem incredibly old-fashioned nowadays. And unfortunately, Marin and I are lovers of this artifact that's going out of fashion rapidly. But maybe I would put forward the idea that the purpose of this book is to create something that Guus also loves quite a lot, which is a ruin before or at the stage of its production. So already this book is a bit of a ruin. It's a bit of a decayed structure of half-formed truths and hidden narratives and fragments of pieces of production that hopefully, you know, generations from now, someone will pick up and read it as such, as only hinting towards what Het Nieuwe Instituut might be. Because to actually describe what an institute is impossible.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Moran.
Now, for me, this book is actually also about an experience. I mean, I can be very critical indeed towards making books. For me, it's indeed not necessary to make a book for everything. So I think you always have to ask the question to yourself, is it necessary? And I see many people would like to make book. Of course, that's also the object which survives very often, especially compared to an exhibition. It's there for a period and then it's gone, while the book lasts forever, kind of. But in this case, yeah, of course, we talked a lot about it. I mean, we started to talk about, even before Brendan, already about the book about the New Institute a couple of years ago. Like, what could it be? What should it be? And which was difficult, because the New Institute is intense, immense. There's many things are happening. So in a way, you also need to narrow down. And then when Brendan was involved, and of course being asked, of course, to be the editor of this book, I think, yeah, you really narrowed it down to the exhibitions, etc. But for me, this book became, and I think that's what I'm really happy with, in terms of an experience. And it's also about, I think it all comes together. So that's also, of course, within exhibitions. For 8 years, once in a while you visit. Not everybody is following everything. But here, actually, it all comes together, so you can really reflect yourself and see actually how things, because at the end, many topics are, you know, there are quite a lot of red threads going through the New Institutes, which maybe were not so obvious for everybody. But I think here they come together. And especially, to be honest, I really enjoyed a lot reading the interviews Brandon did with all these people. I think they really give a very interesting insight, and I think it's very valuable also for the people who work at the New Institute itself.
That's true.
So it's not only for the, it's for everybody. Yeah? So I think it opens up a lot. So in that sense, I think it's an experience. It's not only a representation of what has been done, but it's also an experience on its own. And it's and also the voices of different people in that sense, hearing it, and then so I don't know.
Okay, yeah, beautiful. Yeah, meanwhile you were talking, I had this image of, you know, people contesting together within and outside, I mean, and around the institution. Well, so time runs super fast, so we now have to close our conversation. I have just one final question for Guus. I know that you are now thinking about a new project in Maastricht. Could you just give us like a an idea what it is?
Well, let me first tell you that I was, of course, extremely privileged to work with Brandon and Maureen on this book. And I would like to say that one more time, you know, to be able to introduce a kind of sensitivity which only comes, and that's maybe a word which Eric also referred to, empathy, you know, because otherwise the book